May 14, 1944, Naval Base San Diego, California. Lieutenant James Forrester stood on the sun-drenched pier, watching as the transport ship docked, carrying 200 Japanese prisoners of war captured from the recent Marshall Islands campaign. The golden California sun reflected off the Pacific waters, creating a deceptive serenity that belied the tensions of a world at war. Lieutenant Forrester believed this temporary assignment supervising prisoner transfers would be the most mundane chapter in his naval career. How completely wrong he would be proven in the months ahead. Before we dive into this story, drop a quick hi in the comments and tell me where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. This is the extraordinary account of how an impulsive decision made in a moment of careless bravado would transform 2 lives forever and challenge the deepest prejudices of a nation divided by war. "They look half-starved," remarked Ensign Robert Caldwell, squinting at the first prisoners descending the gangplank. The young officer had been assigned to Lieutenant Forrester's prisoner processing team just 3 days earlier. "Most of them surrendered after weeks without proper rations," Forrester explained, reviewing his clipboard. "According to the manifest, 16 required medical attention during transport." Forrester was 29 years old, a career naval officer who had graduated from the academy at Annapolis in 1937. With sandy brown hair kept meticulously trimmed and a lean physique maintained through rigorous daily exercise, he exemplified the Navy's standards of presentation. His record was spotless, his promotions timely, and his reputation for efficiency well established. Yet his current assignment, overseeing the transfer of enemy prisoners to the recently established Camp Sunnyvale in Northern California, felt like a career sidetrack, while the real war raged across the Pacific. "Lieutenant, sir," called a voice from behind. Forrester turned to see Petty Officer First Class Daniel Wilkins approaching at a brisk pace. "The transport trucks are in position, sir. We can begin prisoner transfer whenever you give the word." "Very good, Wilkins. Let's get them moving as soon as processing is complete." The processing center had been established in a converted warehouse at the edge of the naval base. Inside, 8 processing stations had been arranged in parallel rows, each staffed with a translator, a medical officer, and a records clerk. The procedure was straightforward: identification, medical examination, documentation, and assignment to a transport group. As the prisoners filed into the warehouse, Forrester noted their defeated demeanor. Most kept their eyes downcast, moving with the mechanical compliance of men who had surrendered. Not just their weapons, but their pride. Dressed in mismatched American-issued clothing that hung loosely on their frames, they bore little resemblance to the fanatical enemy portrayed in war propaganda posters. "Remember, these men are still enemy combatants," Forrester instructed his team. "Maintain protocol at all times. No unnecessary conversation, no personal interactions." The processing proceeded with military precision. At each station, prisoners stated their name, rank, and unit, submitted to a brief medical examination, and were photographed before being directed to a holding area to await transport. By mid-afternoon, the operation was nearly complete. Forrester was reviewing the final manifest when Wilkins appeared at his side again. "Sir, we have a situation at Station 4. "What kind of situation, Wilkins?" "One of the prisoners, sir. He speaks perfect English. Been asking to speak with the commanding officer." Forrester frowned. "Did the translator ascertain what he wants?" "Says he has information, sir. Military intelligence that could be valuable." With a sigh, Forrester set down his clipboard. "I'll handle this. Continue with the processing." Station 4 was supervised by Lieutenant Junior Grade Margaret Sullivan, a wave officer, who served as both nurse and translator. As Forrester approached, he observed her speaking with a prisoner who stood perfectly straight, his posture noticeably different from the hunched submission of his fellow captives. "Lieutenant Forrester," Sullivan said, "this is prisoner Takahashi Kenji, former interpreter with the Imperial Japanese Navy." Takahashi bowed slightly. "Lieutenant Forrester, thank you for agreeing to speak with me." His English was indeed flawless, with only the slightest accent. Forrester estimated him to be in his early 30s, with an intelligent face and calm, assessing eyes that seemed to absorb every detail of his surroundings. "I understand you have information," Forrester said curtly. "I served as translator for Admiral Yamamoto's staff until March of last year. Takahashi replied. "I was reassigned to Kwajalein Atoll before the Admiral's death. I have knowledge of Japanese naval codes and communication protocols that may be of interest to your intelligence officers." Forrester maintained a neutral expression, though his interest was piqued. If true, this prisoner might indeed possess valuable intelligence. Yamamoto had been Japan's most brilliant naval strategist, the architect of the Pearl Harbor attack. American intelligence had intercepted and decoded Japanese communications about his inspection tour in April 1943, leading to the operation that shot down his aircraft, a significant victory that had been kept secret from the public. "That's a significant claim, Takahashi. Why volunteer this information now?" The prisoner held Forrester's gaze. "I have come to believe that Japan cannot win this war, Lieutenant. Prolonging the conflict will only result in more suffering for both sides." Forrester studied the man, trying to determine if this was a genuine offer or some form of deception. "I'll arrange for you to speak with intelligence officers at Camp Sunnyvale. Until then, you'll be processed like everyone else." "I understand," Takahashi said, bowing again. "Thank you for your consideration." As Forrester turned to leave, Sullivan called after him. "Sir, there's one more thing. Medical examination shows Takahashi has a condition requiring regular treatment. Dr. Pearson recommends he be transferred to the Naval Hospital rather than the camp." "What condition?" "Tuberculosis, early stages. Treatable, but requires monitoring and medication." Forrester glanced back at the prisoner, who maintained his dignified posture despite the revelation of his illness. "Make the arrangements, Lieutenant Sullivan. Have him transferred to the hospital under guard." "Yes, sir." Later that evening, Forrester joined several fellow officers at the Anchor, a bar frequented by naval personnel near the base. The day's events had left him thoughtful, and he nursed his bourbon while the conversation flowed around him. "Earth to Forrester," said Commander William Hayes, nudging his arm. "You've barely said 2 words since we got here." Hayes was Forrester's closest friend, a classmate from Annapolis, who now served as an engineering officer on the USS Enterprise. His ship was in for repairs, giving the 2 friends a rare opportunity to reconnect. "Just tired," Forrester replied. "Spent the day processing Japanese prisoners." "Ah, the glamorous war work," Hayes chuckled. "While some of us are out there facing Japanese Zeros, you're shuffling paperwork." It was good-natured ribbing, but it stung nonetheless. Forrester had applied for sea duty multiple times, only to be repeatedly assigned to administrative roles where his organizational skills were deemed most valuable. "There was one interesting case," Forrester said, lowering his voice. "A prisoner who claims he worked with Admiral Yamamoto. Speaks perfect English." "Probably trying to get better treatment," remarked Lieutenant Commander Richard Powell, who had joined their table. Powell was an intelligence officer stationed at the base. "These Japanese are crafty. Can't trust a word they say." "This one seemed different," Forrester replied. "I don't know. Something about him." "Don't tell me you're going soft on the enemy, Forrester," Powell said, signaling the bartender for another round. "Hardly. Just saying he might actually have useful information." "Well, your prisoner won't be your concern after tomorrow anyway," Hayes said. "Once they're at Camp Sunnyvale, they become the Army's problem." "Not all of them. One's being transferred to the Naval Hospital. Tuberculosis." Powell snorted. "Using our medical resources on enemy combatants. Typical bureaucratic nonsense." "It's in the Geneva Convention," Forrester pointed out. "We're obligated to provide medical care." "Geneva Convention," Powell repeated mockingly. "I'm sure the Japanese are following that to the letter in their camps." The conversation shifted to recent operations in the Pacific, and Forrester found his thoughts returning to Takahashi Kenji. There had been something in the prisoner's manner, a dignity and intelligence that contradicted the caricatured image of the enemy that prevailed in wartime America. 3 days later, Forrester received new orders. Instead of returning to his regular duties after the prisoner transfer, he was being assigned to coordinate with the Naval Hospital on the care and debriefing of high-value prisoners. His first task, assess the intelligence value of prisoner Takahashi Kenji. The Naval Hospital was a sprawling complex of white buildings set on landscaped grounds overlooking the bay. Forrester made his way to the isolation ward where Takahashi was being kept separate from American patients. He found the prisoner sitting by the window of a small spare room, reading a book. 2 armed Marines stood guard outside the door. "Prisoner Takahashi," Forrester announced as he entered. Takahashi looked up and immediately stood, setting his book aside. "Lieutenant Forrester, I did not expect to see you again." "I've been assigned to evaluate your claims regarding intelligence value," Forrester said, keeping his tone businesslike. "We'll be having regular debriefing sessions until we determine whether your information warrants further action." "I understand. I am at your disposal." Forrester noticed the book on the bed, a well-worn copy of Mark Twain's The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. "An interesting choice of reading material," he commented. A small smile appeared on Takahashi's face. "American literature has been a passion of mine since university. Mark Twain captures something essential about your national character, I think." "And what would that be?" "A kind of stubborn individualism, a distrust of authority, and beneath the humor, a moral core that questions the rules society imposes." Forrester was taken aback by the analysis. "Where did you learn to speak English so well?" "I studied at Stanford University from 1934 to 1936, Takahashi replied. "I returned to Japan when tensions between our countries began to escalate." This information hadn't been in Takahashi's file. "You lived in California for 2 wonderful years. I had hoped to complete my doctorate in American literature, but my father fell ill, and I was recalled to fulfill my family obligations. Upon returning to Japan, I was drafted into the Navy as an interpreter." Forrester pulled a chair from the corner and sat, maintaining a professional distance. "Let's start with the basics. What exactly was your role with Admiral Yamamoto's staff?" For the next 2 hours, Takahashi provided a detailed account of his service as a translator and cultural interpreter for high-level meetings between Japanese naval officers and diplomats from Axis nations. His recollection of names, dates, and locations was precise, and he offered insights into the command structure of the Japanese Navy that aligned with existing intelligence. As their session concluded, Forrester found himself reluctantly impressed. "We'll continue tomorrow," he said, rising to leave. "May I ask a question, Lieutenant?" Takahashi said. Forrester hesitated, then nodded. "The nurse mentioned that I might be permitted access to the hospital library once my quarantine period ends. Is this possible?" The request was modest enough. "I'll look into it," Forrester replied. Over the following weeks, Forrester met with Takahashi almost daily. Their debriefing sessions gradually evolved into more wide-ranging conversations as it became clear that the prisoner's knowledge of Japanese codes had already been superseded by more recent intelligence gathered from other sources. Nevertheless, Takahashi provided valuable context for interpreting decoded messages and offered insights into the psychological aspects of Japanese military culture that American intelligence analysts found useful. During one session in early June, Forrester arrived to find Takahashi looking noticeably weaker, his face pale and drawn. "Are you unwell?" Forrester asked, setting aside his usual notepad. "The medications have side effects," Takahashi explained with a wan smile. "Dr. Morris assures me this is normal. I will be fine." Forrester frowned. "Perhaps we should postpone today's session." "No, please. Our conversations are the highlight of my days here." Takahashi gestured to a chair. "I have been thinking about your question regarding the Imperial Japanese Navy's fuel reserves. I believe I can offer some perspective on this." Despite his obvious discomfort, Takahashi proceeded to provide a detailed analysis of Japan's increasingly desperate petroleum situation, explaining how fuel shortages were affecting strategic decisions. "The attacks on your fuel depots and tankers have been devastatingly effective," he concluded. "Many of our ships now sit in harbor, unable to conduct even training exercises due to fuel rationing." "That aligns with our intelligence," Forrester acknowledged. "Your insights help confirm our assessment." Takahashi nodded, then suddenly began coughing, a deep, racking cough that shook his thin frame. Forrester impulsively poured a glass of water from the pitcher on the bedside table and handed it to him. "Thank you," Takahashi said when the coughing subsided. His eyes met Forrester's with unexpected frankness. May I speak openly, Lieutenant? Go ahead. I sense you are uncomfortable with your current assignment. You would prefer to be serving at sea, fighting alongside your comrades. Forrester stiffened. My preferences are irrelevant. I serve where the Navy directs me. Of course. Forgive my presumption. Takahashi looked down at his hands. It is only that I understand the feeling of being misplaced, of serving one's country in ways one did not anticipate. The comment struck uncomfortably close to home, and Forrester changed the subject. Tell me more about your time at Stanford. Were you there when the Japanese foreign minister visited California in 1935? As June turned to July, Takahashi's health improved under the hospital's care. He was granted limited access to the hospital grounds, always under guard, and allowed to borrow books from the library. Forrester continued their debriefing sessions, though they increasingly served as a formality, as the intelligence value of Takahashi's knowledge diminished with time. On Independence Day, Forrester found himself once again at the Anchor with Hayes and several other officers, celebrating the holiday with drinks and conversation that inevitably turned to the progress of the war. The Marianas campaign is going well, Hayes reported. Once we take Saipan and Tinian, we'll have airfields within bombing range of the Japanese home islands. About time, said Powell, who had joined them again. Maybe we can finally bring this war to an end. Speaking of enemies, Hayes said, turning to Forrester with a mischievous grin. How's your pet Jap doing, still pumping him for information? Forrester frowned at the characterization. Takahashi? He's cooperated fully. Intelligence has verified much of what he's told us. You're on a first-name basis now? Powell raised an eyebrow. Careful, Forrester. These prisoners are trained to gain sympathy. It's just efficiency, Forrester replied defensively. His full name is a mouthful. Sure it is, Hayes chuckled. Next you'll be inviting him to dinner. Don't be ridiculous. Actually, Powell interjected, word around the base is that you've been spending an awful lot of time with this prisoner. Some people are starting to talk. Forrester felt his face flush with anger. I've been following orders, conducting authorized debriefing sessions, nothing more. Hey, we're just ribbing you, Hayes said, sensing Forrester's genuine irritation. No one's actually questioning your loyalty. But they are questioning my judgment, Forrester said flatly. An uncomfortable silence fell over the table before Powell broke it. Look, all we're saying is, be careful. War makes for strange situations. Men can get confused about where their sympathies should lie. My sympathies lie with ending this war as quickly as possible, Forrester said firmly. If debriefing this prisoner helps in any way, that's what I'll continue to do. Hayes raised his glass. To ending the war, then, and to friends who keep each other honest. The others joined the toast, but the earlier camaraderie of the evening had dissipated. Forrester finished his drink and made an excuse to leave early, disturbed by the implications of Powell's comments. The following week brought a development that would dramatically alter the course of Forrester's assignment. Admiral Chester Kimmel, commander of naval intelligence for the Western Sea frontier, visited the base on a tour of inspection. After reviewing operational reports, he requested a meeting with Forrester regarding prisoner Takahashi. Lieutenant, the Admiral said when Forrester reported to his temporary office, I've read your debriefing reports with interest. This prisoner seems to have been quite forthcoming. Yes, sir. He's been cooperative from the beginning. And you believe his information has been reliable? For the most part, sir. Some details have been outdated, but nothing has proven deliberately false. The Admiral nodded thoughtfully. I have a proposition that requires your input. We're considering using Takahashi for a special project, one that would take advantage of his linguistic abilities and cultural knowledge. What kind of project, sir? Propaganda broadcasts. Messages directed at Japanese troops encouraging surrender. Studies show these are most effective when delivered by fellow Japanese, especially those who can speak to the good treatment they've received as prisoners. Forrester considered this. And you believe Takahashi would agree to participate? That's what I need you to determine, Lieutenant. You've spent more time with him than anyone else. Would he be willing to record messages emphasizing the humane treatment of prisoners and the futility of continued resistance? The question gave Forrester pause. Such participation would be seen as an act of treason by Japanese authorities. If Japan were to ultimately win the war, or even if Takahashi were ever repatriated to Japan after a peace settlement, he could face severe consequences. "I'm not certain, sir," Forrester replied honestly. "It would be asking a great deal of him." "Indeed it would," the Admiral agreed. "But war requires difficult choices from all of us. Sound him out, Lieutenant. See if he might be amenable. If he agrees, we'll transfer him to our psychological warfare unit in San Francisco. If not, he'll remain here until he's well enough to join the general prisoner population at Camp Sunnyvale." "Yes, sir, I'll speak with him." "Good. And Forrester?" "Sir?" "This conversation is classified. I understand you're friendly with some intelligence officers who frequent the Anchor. This is not to be discussed with them or anyone else." "Understood, sir." When Forrester arrived for his next session with Takahashi, he found the prisoner sitting in a chair on the small balcony adjoining his room, sketching the view of the bay with a pencil and pad that had been provided by one of the nurses. "You have artistic talent," Forrester observed, genuinely surprised by the skillful rendering. Takahashi looked up with a slight smile. "Merely a hobby. My father was disappointed when I chose literature over art for my studies. He was a respected painter in Kyoto." Forrester sat in the adjacent chair, noting how much healthier Takahashi appeared compared to their first meetings. The medical treatment was clearly having a positive effect. "I need to discuss something important with you," Forrester began, deciding that directness was the best approach. "A proposal from High Command." He explained the propaganda broadcast project as neutrally as possible, being careful not to pressure or influence Takahashi's response one way or the other. When he finished, Takahashi set his sketchpad aside and gazed out at the horizon for several long moments. "To encourage my countrymen to surrender," he finally said, his voice quiet but steady. "To suggest they have been misled by their leaders. That's the essence of it, yes." Takahashi turned to face Forrester directly. "You know what this would mean for me. In Japan, I would be considered a traitor." "I do understand that," Forrester acknowledged. "No one will force you to participate. If you decline, it won't affect your medical treatment or prisoner status." "May I ask what you would do in my position, Lieutenant?" The question caught Forrester off guard. I can't say. Our situations are too different." "Are they?" Takahashi's gaze was penetrating. "We are both men caught in a war not of our making, trying to serve what we believe is right while honoring our personal codes of conduct. The specifics differ, but the essential dilemma is the same." Forrester shifted uncomfortably. "The decision has to be yours. I'm only authorized to present the option." "I understand." Takahashi looked back out at the bay. "I will need time to consider. May I give you my answer tomorrow?" "Of course." As Forrester rose to leave, Takahashi spoke again. "Lieutenant, regardless of my decision, I want you to know that I appreciate the respect you have shown me during our conversations. It has meant a great deal." Forrester nodded, unsure how to respond to the unexpected expression of gratitude. "Until tomorrow, then." That evening, Forrester found himself unable to sleep, his mind circling around Takahashi's predicament and his own conflicted feelings about the assignment. He had begun to regard the prisoner not as an enemy combatant, but as a man of intellect and principle caught on the wrong side of history. The prospect of potentially sending him to a propaganda unit where he would be pressured to betray his country troubled Forrester more than he cared to admit. When he arrived at the hospital the next morning, Takahashi was waiting for him, sitting erect in his chair by the window, hands folded in his lap. "I have made my decision," he said without preamble. "I will participate in the broadcast project, but I have one condition." "What condition?" Forrester asked. "I will not speak falsely about my experiences as a prisoner. I will not exaggerate or invent mistreatment by Japanese authorities, nor will I denounce the Emperor. I will speak only of what I have personally observed and believe to be true." It was a principled position that threaded a narrow path between cooperation and compromise. Forrester respected it immediately. "I believe those terms will be acceptable," he said. "I'll inform my superiors." "Thank you." Takahashi bowed slightly from his seated position. When would this transfer occur? Soon, I imagine, within days, once arrangements are made. A shadow of something, regret, resignation, passed across Takahashi's face. Then, our conversations will come to an end. Yes, Forrester confirmed, surprised to find himself sharing the sentiment. Though I'll likely be required to provide a full briefing to the psychological warfare unit about our discussions. Of course. Takahashi reached for his sketchpad and carefully tore out the drawing he had been working on the previous day. Please accept this, Lieutenant, as a token of my appreciation for your professional courtesy. Forrester hesitated, then took the offered sketch. It was a beautifully rendered view of San Diego Bay, capturing both the natural beauty of the coastline and the military presence of ships in the harbor. Thank you, he said, genuinely moved by the gesture. It's excellent work. A memory of California, Takahashi said softly, for both of us. 3 days later, Forrester received orders to escort Takahashi to the Naval Intelligence Facility in San Francisco, where the propaganda broadcasts would be recorded. The journey would take them up the coast by train, with an overnight stay in Los Angeles due to connection schedules. As they boarded the train, Takahashi drew curious and occasionally hostile glances from other passengers. Though dressed in civilian clothes provided by the Navy, his Japanese features marked him as someone to be regarded with suspicion in wartime America. The 2 Marines accompanying them as security detail created a buffer of space, but did little to dispel the tension. Ignore them, Forrester advised quietly, as they took their seats in a semi-private compartment. Most civilians have never seen a Japanese person except in propaganda posters. I'm accustomed to it, Takahashi replied with dignity. During my university days, I encountered similar reactions, though less intense before Pearl Harbor. The journey north provided hours of conversation as the coastal landscape rolled by outside their window. With the imminent conclusion of their professional relationship, Forrester found himself asking questions that strayed beyond the boundaries of military intelligence. What would you have done, he asked at one point, if you had been able to complete your doctorate? Would you have stayed in America? Takahashi considered this thoughtfully. I had hoped to become a professor, teaching Japanese literature to American students and American literature to Japanese students, a bridge between cultures. He smiled wryly. The war has made such bridges difficult to imagine now. Wars end, Forrester found himself saying. People rebuild. Some bridges once broken cannot be easily restored, Takahashi replied. The wounds between our nations will run deep. You don't think reconciliation is possible? I think it will require extraordinary effort and exceptional individuals on both sides. Takahashi studied Forrester with an assessing gaze. Men who can see beyond national identity to recognize common humanity. The conversation fell into a contemplative silence as the train continued its northward journey. By the time they reached Los Angeles, a peculiar bond had formed between prisoner and escort, not quite friendship, but a mutual respect that transcended their official roles. That evening, as they dined under guard in a private room at the hotel restaurant, they were approached by a group of naval officers who recognized Forrester from a previous posting. Jim Forrester, called out Lieutenant Commander Edward Blake. What brings you to Los Angeles? Forrester rose to greet his former colleague, aware of Takahashi sitting silently at the table. Just passing through on assignment, Ed. Good to see you. Blake's eyes fell on Takahashi, and his expression hardened. What's this? Dining with a Jap? This is a prisoner transfer, Commander, Forrester replied stiffly. Classified assignment. Must be some important prisoner to rate a restaurant meal, Blake remarked with undisguised disapproval. The rest of us are fighting these bastards while you're playing nursemaid. Forrester felt his temper rising but maintained his professional demeanor. If you'll excuse us, Commander, we need to finish our meal before continuing our journey. Sure, Blake said, raising his hands in mock surrender. But as he turned to rejoin his companions, he added loudly enough to be heard. Just make sure you don't get too friendly with the enemy, Forrester. People might start to wonder. The insult hung in the air as Blake walked away. Forrester sat down, his appetite gone, and noticed Takahashi studying him with concern. Such encounters must make your assignment difficult, the prisoner observed quietly. It's nothing, Forrester muttered, though the implications of Blake's comment had struck a nerve. It was the second time his professional conduct had been questioned because of his association with Takahashi. Honor is a complex thing during wartime, Takahashi said. In Japan, treating an enemy with respect would not be seen as weakness but as a reflection of one's own character. It's not so different here, Forrester replied, at least in principle. They finished their meal in relative silence, each lost in his own thoughts. As they prepared to leave, Blake's group began a raucous toast at the bar, clearly having consumed several drinks since their earlier encounter. "Hey, Forrester," Blake called out, "I've got a proposition for you." Forrester attempted to ignore him, signaling the Marines to escort Takahashi toward the exit. $50 says you wouldn't marry that Jap prisoner of yours, Blake continued loudly, drawing attention from everyone in the restaurant. "That's how sure I am you're getting soft." Forrester froze, his face flushing with anger. The absurdity of the taunt was matched only by its offensiveness. He turned slowly to face Blake, aware that every eye in the room was on him. "That's enough, Commander," he said in a low, dangerous voice. "You're drunk and out of line." "Am I?" Blake sneered. "Then prove me wrong. Accept the bet." $50 says you wouldn't do it. Something snapped in Forrester. A combination of frustration at his sidelined military career, anger at the repeated questioning of his loyalty, and genuine outrage at the disrespect being shown not just to himself, but to Takahashi, who had conducted himself with unfailing dignity throughout his captivity. "You know what, Blake? You're on." The words left his mouth before he could reconsider. $100 says I would." A stunned silence fell over the room. "You're bluffing," Blake finally said, though his confident tone had faltered. "Am I?" Forrester reached into his wallet, pulled out a $100 bill and slapped it on the nearest table. "There's my money. Where's yours?" Blake looked around at his companions, seemingly uncertain how to respond to Forrester's unexpected challenge. After a moment of hesitation, he reached for his own wallet and extracted two $50 bills, which he placed beside Forrester's money. "You'd actually marry a Japanese prisoner for $100? Blake asked incredulously. "No," Forrester replied coldly. "I'd do it to prove that some of us still understand what honor means, even in wartime." With that, he turned on his heel and strode toward the exit where Takahashi and the Marines were waiting, leaving a stunned silence in his wake. Outside the restaurant, Takahashi regarded him with an unreadable expression. "An interesting exchange," he said mildly. "Ignore it," Forrester said curtly. "Blake's a fool." But as they made their way back to their rooms, Forrester couldn't shake the implications of what had just transpired. In a moment of anger, he had made a reckless claim that now hung between them like an undetonated mine. He had defended Takahashi's dignity, yes, but at what cost to his own career and reputation if word of this confrontation spread? Yet beneath his concern lurked an unexpected realization. In that moment of defiance, he had felt more himself, more aligned with his core values, than at any other point in his military service. The war had demanded many compromises, but in refusing to let Blake's disrespect stand unchallenged, Forrester had reclaimed something essential that he hadn't realized he was in danger of losing. As they reached the door to Takahashi's guarded room, the prisoner turned to him with a slight bow. "Good night, Lieutenant Forrester, and thank you for your intervention, unnecessary though it was." "It was necessary," Forrester replied firmly. "To me." Their eyes met in a moment of perfect understanding before Takahashi nodded once and entered his room, the Marines taking up their posts outside. Alone in his own room, Forrester poured himself a whiskey from his travel flask and stood by the window, looking out at the lights of Los Angeles. The city seemed impossibly normal, restaurants and theaters still operating, people going about their lives as if a global conflict wasn't raging across the ocean. What had he done? And more importantly, what would he do next? The bet with Blake had been a moment of madness, but it had revealed a truth that Forrester was only now beginning to acknowledge. His view of Takahashi, and by extension of the conflict itself, had shifted profoundly during their weeks of interaction. The neat categories of ally and enemy, us and them, had blurred into something far more complex and human. Tomorrow they would continue to San Francisco, where Takahashi would be transferred to the propaganda unit and likely pass out of Forrester's life forever. The incident in the restaurant would become just another wartime anecdote, the bet forgotten or dismissed as a momentary lapse of judgment. Or would it? As Forrester finished his whiskey and prepared for bed, a radical thought took shape in his mind, one that would either prove his finest hour or the most catastrophic mistake of his life. The following morning, Forrester woke with a clarity of purpose that surprised him. The reckless bet with Blake now seemed less like a moment of madness and more like an opportunity, a chance to take a stand against the dehumanizing aspects of the war that had troubled him increasingly in recent months. During breakfast, Takahashi noticed his contemplative mood. "You seem preoccupied, Lieutenant," he observed quietly as they sat in the hotel's private dining room, the two Marine guards positioned discreetly nearby. "I've been thinking about what happened last night," Forrester admitted. "About the bet." Takahashi nodded, his expression careful. An unfortunate incident, but not unusual in wartime. Men seek ways to assert their patriotism, often at the expense of others. "It wasn't just about patriotism," Forrester replied. "It was about respect. Human dignity. Nevertheless, it is forgotten now," Takahashi said diplomatically. "We continue to San Francisco, and our paths will soon diverge." Forrester hesitated, then made his decision. "What if they didn't?" Takahashi looked at him with puzzled eyes. "I don't understand." Lowering his voice to ensure the Marines couldn't overhear, Forrester leaned forward. "What if we actually did it? What if we went through with the marriage?" The prisoner's composure faltered for the first time since Forrester had known him. "Lieutenant, are you unwell? Perhaps the confrontation affected you more deeply than you realize." "I'm perfectly well," Forrester assured him. "Listen carefully. California has no law explicitly prohibiting marriage between an American and a Japanese national. It would be controversial, certainly unprecedented during wartime, but technically legal." "But why?" Takahashi asked, genuine confusion in his voice. "To win a wager, that seems insufficient." "Not for the bet," Forrester clarified, "though that was the catalyst. Think about what it would represent, a symbolic rejection of the idea that our humanity is defined by which side of the conflict we happen to be on." "A powerful symbol, perhaps," Takahashi acknowledged, "but at what cost to you? Your career, your reputation." "I've spent the war shuffling papers while others fight," Forrester interrupted. "Maybe this is my way of fighting, against the hatred that makes wars possible in the first place." Takahashi studied him thoughtfully. "And what would it mean for me? As a prisoner, do I even have the right to consent?" It was a fair question that Forrester had already considered. "Legally, yes. Your status as a prisoner affects your freedom of movement, not your capacity to enter legal agreements. But more importantly, I wouldn't proceed without your genuine consent." "What would happen afterward? Would such a marriage change my status?" "Technically, you would become the spouse of an American citizen. It might complicate your prisoner status, possibly even create a path to residency after the war." Forrester paused. "Though I should be clear, this would be a marriage of principle, not of conventional nature." A flicker of amusement crossed Takahashi's face. "I had assumed as much, Lieutenant." Their conversation was interrupted as one of the Marines approached to inform them it was time to depart for the train station. As they gathered their few belongings, Takahashi spoke quietly. "I need time to consider your proposal. It is unexpected." "Of course," and Forrester replied. "We have the train journey to discuss it further." The coastal train to San Francisco provided both privacy and time. As California's landscape rolled by outside their window, Forrester and Takahashi spoke in hushed tones, weighing the implications of the unprecedented step they were contemplating. "If we do this," Takahashi said carefully, "we must be clear about our motivations, not as a statement against Japan or America, but as an affirmation of something that transcends national conflicts." "Exactly," Forrester agreed. "A recognition that even in war there are principles that should remain inviolable: human dignity, mutual respect, the possibility of understanding across divisions." Your military superiors would not see it that way. Probably not, Forrester admitted. There would be consequences, for both of us. They fell silent, watching the Pacific Ocean glimmer in the distance. Finally, Takahashi turned to face Forrester directly. "I accept," he said simply. Forrester exhaled slowly, feeling both relief and apprehension. "You're certain?" "In uncertain times, one must still act according to one's deepest convictions," Takahashi replied. "If this small act can stand as a testament to the possibility of understanding between our peoples, then it has meaning beyond our individual circumstances." With their decision made, the practical challenges became the focus. Upon arriving in San Francisco, Forrester requested a 24-hour delay in transferring Takahashi to the propaganda unit, citing a need to complete final debriefing reports. The request was granted without suspicion. Administrative delays were commonplace in military operations. The following morning, while ostensibly taking Takahashi for a final medical examination, Forrester instead directed their driver to the San Francisco City Hall. The Marines accompanying them were understandably confused, but followed orders when Forrester explained they needed to complete documentation related to Takahashi's prisoner status. Inside City Hall, they approached the Marriage License Bureau. The clerk's eyes widened as she took in the unusual group: an American naval officer, a Japanese man in civilian clothes, and 2 armed Marines. "We'd like to apply for a marriage license," Forrester stated calmly, placing his identification on the counter. The clerk looked from Forrester to Takahashi and back again. "Is this some kind of joke, Lieutenant?" "No, ma'am, we're quite serious. You want to marry him?" She couldn't keep the incredulity from her voice. "That's correct." The clerk fumbled for words. I need to consult with my supervisor." As she hurried away, one of the Marines leaned toward Forrester. "Sir, what exactly is going on here?" "Something important, Corporal," Forrester replied. "I'll explain everything afterward." The clerk returned with an older man who introduced himself as the Deputy Registrar. "Lieutenant Forrester, this is most unusual. I'm not certain we can proceed." "I've reviewed the relevant statutes," Forrester countered. "There's no legal prohibition against this marriage in California. That may be technically true, but then we insist on exercising our legal right." Forrester interrupted firmly. "Unless you can cite a specific law that prevents it." The Deputy Registrar looked deeply uncomfortable, but eventually conceded. "Very well, but there will be a 72-hour waiting period after the license is issued." "That's not acceptable," Forrester replied. "I'm under orders to complete this prisoner transfer today. As a military necessity during wartime, I request an exemption from the waiting period." The invocation of military necessity, however questionable in this context, and Forrester's confident tone ultimately prevailed. 2 hours later, after navigating a bureaucratic labyrinth and enduring increasingly bewildered looks from both civil servants and the Marine Guards, Lieutenant James Forrester and Takahashi Kenji stood before a judge who agreed to perform the ceremony immediately. The wedding itself was brief and austere. No rings were exchanged, no vows beyond the minimum required by law. The Marines served as reluctant witnesses, still confused but following Forrester's orders to maintain their professional composure. "By the authority vested in me by the state of California, I now pronounce you legally married," the judge concluded, looking as if he expected military police to burst through the door at any moment. Forrester and Takahashi shook hands formally, an appropriately restrained conclusion to what was, in every practical sense, a marriage of principle rather than passion. As they left City Hall, marriage certificate in hand, the reality of what they had done began to sink in. The Marines exchanged glances that suggested they believed their lieutenant had lost his mind, though they maintained their discipline and said nothing. "What happens now?" Takahashi asked quietly as they walked toward their waiting vehicle. "Now we proceed to naval intelligence as planned," Forrester replied. "You'll be transferred to the propaganda unit as ordered. I'll submit my report, including documentation of our marriage, and face whatever consequences come." "And then?" Forrester managed a small smile. "And then we've made our statement, whatever happens next." The consequences were swift and severe. Within hours of submitting his report, Forrester was placed under house arrest pending investigation for conduct unbecoming an officer. Takahashi was immediately transferred to a secure facility for questioning about potential espionage or psychological manipulation. For 3 weeks, Forrester was confined to quarters, subjected to daily interrogations, psychological evaluations, and stern lectures from increasingly high-ranking officers. The Navy, blindsided by his unprecedented action, seemed uncertain whether to court-martial him, discharge him, or quietly transfer him to some remote outpost where his mental breakdown could be forgotten. Throughout the ordeal, Forrester maintained a calm, reasoned defense of his actions. He emphasized that he had violated no military regulations or laws, that the marriage was a principled stand against dehumanization, and that he had at no point compromised military security or his duties. Finally, in early August, a decision came down from the highest levels of naval command. Lieutenant James Forrester would receive an honorable discharge from the United States Navy. The unusual resolution reflected both the embarrassment his action had caused and the recognition that a public court-martial would only draw more attention to an incident the military preferred to bury. As for Takahashi, he was eventually permitted to continue his work with the propaganda unit, though under much stricter supervision. His broadcasts, which encouraged Japanese troops to surrender with assurances of humane treatment, proved unexpectedly effective, perhaps because they conveyed a genuine conviction that reconciliation between enemies was possible. Forrester, now a civilian, took a position teaching naval history at a small college in Northern California. He made repeated attempts to contact Takahashi through official channels, but was consistently rebuffed by military authorities who seemed determined to prevent any further communication between them. Then, on August 14, 1945, everything changed. Japan surrendered unconditionally following the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The war that had defined both men's lives for years was suddenly over. In the chaotic aftermath of victory, as the massive machinery of war began the complex process of standing down, Forrester received an unexpected telephone call. A clerk from the Office of War Information explained that prisoner Takahashi was being processed for repatriation to Japan, along with thousands of other Japanese prisoners. Before departure, he had requested a meeting with his American spouse. 2 days later, they sat across from each other in a small conference room at the Office of War Information in San Francisco. It was their first meeting in over a year. "You look well," Forrester observed, noting that Takahashi appeared healthier than when they had parted. "As do you," Takahashi replied with a slight smile. "Civilian life agrees with you." "Sometimes," Forrester acknowledged, "though I miss the structure of military life more than I expected." They fell into an easy conversation, catching each other up on the events of the past year. Takahashi described his work with the propaganda unit, which had expanded to include translations for occupation planning. Forrester spoke of his teaching position and his ongoing efforts to advocate for more humane treatment of Japanese Americans who had been interned during the war. "So you're returning to Japan," Forrester finally said, addressing the reason for their meeting. "Yes." Takahashi's expression grew somber. "Though I am uncertain what awaits me there. Japan is not the country I left. Everything has changed. Will you be safe, given your work with American forces?" "I believe so. The occupation authorities have provided documentation indicating I was compelled to assist as a prisoner of war. It should offer some protection." A silence fell between them, heavy with unspoken questions about their unusual legal bond. "I assume you'll want to dissolve our marriage," Forrester said finally. "I've taken the liberty of consulting an attorney. It can be arranged without your needing to remain in the United States." Takahashi studied him thoughtfully. "Actually, I had a different proposal in mind." Forrester raised an eyebrow in surprise. "Oh?" "The occupation forces are seeking Americans with knowledge of Japanese language and culture to assist with reconstruction efforts. Your naval background and our unique connection would make you an ideal candidate." "You're suggesting I come to Japan?" "As part of the occupation administration, yes." Takahashi leaned forward. "The work would be meaningful, helping to rebuild a shattered nation, fostering understanding between former enemies, the very principles that led to our unusual arrangement in the first place. Forrester considered this unexpected proposition. His teaching position was temporary, his future uncertain, and despite the extraordinary circumstances of their connection, he had come to regard Takahashi as perhaps the person who best understood the moral complexity he had navigated during the war. "I'll need to think about it," he said finally. "Of course." Takahashi reached into his jacket and withdrew a small envelope. "My family's address in Kyoto should you decide to accept. My father's house survived the bombing, thankfully." As their meeting drew to a close, they stood and shook hands formally, conscious of the officials waiting outside the door. "Whatever you decide," Takahashi said quietly, "I want you to know that our action, controversial as it was, gave hope to many Japanese prisoners. Word spread, and the idea that an American officer would take such a stand for human dignity beyond national divisions. It mattered." "It mattered to me too," Forrester replied, "more than I can adequately explain." 6 months later, as cherry blossoms began to bloom across a Japan still reeling from defeat, James Forrester arrived in Kyoto as part of the Allied Occupation Administration. His assignment? Cultural liaison for reconstruction projects in the ancient capital, one of the few Japanese cities that had been spared from bombing due to its historical significance. Takahashi met him at the train station, a moment of reunion that bridged worlds torn apart by war. Together, they walked through a city where past and future existed in uneasy balance, ancient temples standing untouched, while modernity began its inexorable advance under American influence. "My father wishes to meet you," Takahashi said as they navigated the narrow streets. "He has many questions, as you might imagine." "I look forward to it," Forrester replied, though he felt a flutter of apprehension at the prospect of explaining their unusual bond to a traditional Japanese family. The Takahashi family home was a traditional wooden structure surrounding a small but exquisite garden. Inside, Takahashi's father, a dignified man in his 70s, waited to receive his son's American husband. The introduction was formal, the conversation that followed anything but. Through Takahashi's translation, his father asked probing questions about Forrester's motivations, his views on the war, his understanding of Japan. There was no hostility in the inquiry, only a deep curiosity about the American who had made such an unorthodox choice. As evening fell and lamps were lit throughout the house, Takahashi's father made a surprising declaration. "My son tells me your marriage was a gesture of principle, not of conventional attachment. Yet in taking this step, you have become part of our family, however unusual the circumstances. You are welcome here, Lieutenant Forrester." In the years that followed, that welcome extended beyond mere courtesy. As Japan rebuilt under occupation, Forrester and Takahashi worked together to bridge cultural divides, using their unique relationship as a symbol of reconciliation. Their legal union, initially a defiant gesture against wartime dehumanization, evolved into a genuine partnership dedicated to healing the wounds of conflict. When the occupation ended in 1952, Forrester chose to remain in Japan. He and Takahashi established an international school in Kyoto, where Japanese students could learn English and American students could study Japanese language and culture. Their institution became a model for educational exchange, earning recognition from both governments as a vital channel for post-war reconciliation. Their marriage, never dissolved, became less a statement and more simply the legal recognition of two lives inextricably intertwined by history, choice, and shared purpose. What had begun as an impulsive bet in a Los Angeles restaurant had transformed into something neither man could have anticipated, a lifelong commitment to demonstrating that understanding across the deepest of divisions was not merely possible, but essential for a world determined never to repeat the catastrophe of global war. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.